Holding on to love when beliefs drift apart, a mother's fight for her daughter's future. It's strange how love and values can coexist in a marriage for years, almost unnoticed, until something so profound shakes them both, leaving one wondering if that common ground ever existed in the first place. I was reflecting on this one late evening, alone in the dim light of my kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge while my mind raced. It had only been a few hours since I'd had one of the hardest conversations of my life with my husband. A man I loved deeply and had shared so many experiences with, yet somehow I found myself questioning if I could really be with him anymore. I still remember how our conversation started. We'd been talking about politics, an increasingly risky topic in our household, especially since we both held some strong opinions that didn't always align. For most of our marriage, we'd skirted around political issues, each holding our views in private spaces, occasionally bringing them up when they were too big to ignore, but often diffusing them with humor or a gentle nod of agreement. That's just how we worked until recently, when our conversations took on an urgency that wasn't there before, especially as we started to discuss our 7-year-old daughter and her future in a world that felt like it was changing every day, sometimes in ways I couldn't accept. My husband had always leaned conservative, voting Republican in every election he could remember. In contrast, I had always considered myself more independent, wary of attaching my values to any political party or ideology. It allowed us some freedom. He could vote his way, and I'd vote mine without the slightest hesitation, and neither of us felt compelled to argue or change each other's minds. But something had changed in me recently. I couldn't tell you if it was the weight of motherhood or the growing fear I felt for my daughter's safety in a world that increasingly seemed to restrict women's choices and autonomy. Either way, I couldn't look at things the same way anymore. One particularly haunting experience drove that change in me. My cousin, who lived in a state with strict anti-abortion laws, had suffered a devastating loss. She was pregnant and excited, but something went tragically wrong. Her baby died in the womb, but because of the restrictive laws, her doctors waited until she was actively dying of sepsis before removing the fetus. The image of her lying there, suffering unnecessarily, haunted me every night since. It was like a slap in the face, a reminder that our bodies, as women, could be so utterly disregarded by those who were supposed to care for us. The thought that my daughter could one day face such a situation, with no choice but to suffer, shook me to my core. That night, I tried to explain all of this to my husband. I laid my fears bare, my voice trembling with a mix of terror and frustration. But he didn't seem to understand. He listened, but I could see the look in his eyes, a quiet discomfort. Maybe even dismissal, like he didn't really grasp why this mattered so much to me. He responded in a calm, measured way, reminding me of his beliefs, how he felt that his political choices were rooted in a desire for a stable economy, a strong family unit, and traditional values. And while I could respect that in theory, I couldn't understand how those values justified putting our daughter's life, her rights, at risk. My words poured out faster than I could stop them. I told him that if anything happened to our daughter, if she were denied life-saving care or shot in school due to lack of gun control, I wouldn't be able to look at him again. I knew it was harsh, and maybe I went too far, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told him that I'd abandon everything, that I couldn't stay with someone who, in my eyes, was complicit in putting our child in danger. He looked wounded, almost devastated, and asked if I would really leave him over something like this. In that moment, as tears filled my eyes, I knew I was being brutally honest. I didn't want to hurt him, but I needed him to understand that this wasn't just politics for me, it was life and death. It was hard, admitting that I would, in fact, consider leaving him, but I knew I had to be honest. I explained how this wasn't about winning an argument, it was about ensuring our daughter had a future where her body, her choices, and her life were respected. I painted him a picture, a horrifying, gut-wrenching image meant to jolt him out of his apathy. I asked him to imagine that our daughter was in mortal danger, that her life was on the line, and he was just standing there, unable to help. It was a graphic analogy, one that might have been too blunt, but I had to make him see it through my eyes. I told him about how I saw it as a slow-motion car crash, one where I could see the devastation coming, yet he seemed unaware of the danger. He looked at me with a mix of disbelief and hurt, and I could see that he was struggling to process everything. For him, This was just another conversation. Another debate. But for me, it was the foundation of our marriage, our family's safety, and our daughter's future. The room was silent after that, filled only with the sound of our labored breathing, both of us too exhausted to continue. I left him there, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air, wondering if he would ever understand what I was trying to say. The next morning, I apologized for my outburst, though I couldn't bring myself to take back my words entirely. I knew I meant what I'd said, even if it had been painful to admit. He accepted my apology tentatively, his face still shadowed by doubt and sadness, and I could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface. We agreed to discuss it again when I was calmer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between us. It was as if a wall had risen between us, one built not from anger or resentment, but from a deep, almost existential divide that I wasn't sure we could ever bridge. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about other families I knew, families that had been torn apart by similar ideological conflicts. I had friends who could no longer speak to their parents, cousins who avoided family gatherings, and colleagues who refused to discuss certain topics with their spouses for fear of what might be said. It was a heartbreaking reality, one that seemed to mirror the divisions in the world around us. And I wondered if we were doomed to the same fate. Could we really find common ground? Or were we simply delaying the inevitable? One evening, I decided to try a different approach. I brought up a hypothetical scenario to my husband, hoping to appeal to his empathy in a way that words alone couldn't. I asked him to imagine what it would be like if he, as a father, had to watch our daughter suffer because someone else had decided what was best for her, regardless of her needs or her wishes. I spoke softly, choosing my words carefully, and as I did, I could see a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small glimmer of hope that perhaps he was beginning to see things from my perspective. The conversation that followed was difficult, raw, and emotional. We talked about the values we shared, the dreams we had for our family, and the fears that kept us awake at night. He admitted that he hadn't considered some of the things I'd mentioned, that he'd been so focused on his own beliefs that he hadn't stopped to think about how they might impact the people he loved. It was a humbling moment for both of us, and as we spoke, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. By the end of our talk, he promised me that he would be there for our daughter, that he would do whatever it took to protect her, even if it meant challenging his own beliefs. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and I knew we still had a long way to go, but it was a start. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the lessons I'd learned from this experience. I realized that love isn't always enough to overcome differences, that sometimes, we have to dig deep and confront uncomfortable truths if we want to build a future together. I learned that empathy is a powerful tool, one that can bridge even the widest divides, and that sometimes, all it takes is a willingness to listen, to understand, and to be vulnerable. As I watched my husband interact with our daughter, his face softened by a newfound sense of purpose. I knew that we still had a long road ahead, but I also knew that we were stronger for having faced this challenge together. That our love was deeper, richer, and more resilient than I had ever imagined. And as I held my daughter close, feeling the warmth of her small hand in mine, I promised myself that I would do everything in my power to protect her, to fight for her future, and to ensure that she would never have to face the same fears that had haunted me for so long. In the end, I realized that love isn't about agreeing on everything, but about standing by each other, even when the world seems determined to pull us. When loyalty breaks my path to self-respect after betrayal. When I stepped off the bus and returned home after 6 long weeks away, I expected the usual sights and sounds, the quiet comfort of my small home, my wife's familiar smile greeting me at the door, maybe even a simple dinner prepared to celebrate my return. But as I opened the door, the eerie silence hinted that something was off. I found my wife sitting casually in the living room, her neck exposed, a fresh tattoo boldly etched on her skin. At first, I felt a strange sense of disbelief, as if I were witnessing something out of place, a scene that couldn't possibly belong in my own life. The tattoo was unmistakable. It was another man's name, intertwined with a small cartoon character, a Pokémon she had often mentioned liking but never one I thought would find its way onto her body. let alone alongside the name of someone who wasn't me. My mind struggled to process the shock, questions flooding in with no answers. In our 4 years of marriage, my wife and I had weathered our fair share of challenges, including my career that demanded frequent relocations and long absences. I had come to terms with this as a necessary sacrifice. But I trusted her deeply. I believed that our relationship could withstand the strain. And I had faith in the loyalty and commitment that we had vowed to each other. This tattoo felt like a betrayal beyond words. It was a deliberate mark, a physical symbol that had been imprinted not just on her skin but on the heart of our marriage. I couldn't even bring myself to ask her directly. When I finally managed a few words, she responded with casual indifference, simply saying, "Oh, I got a Pokemon tattoo." She made no attempt to explain the name or the circumstances. The apathy in her voice cut me even deeper, as if she were daring me to react, challenging my right to be hurt by her decision. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I gathered my belongings and quietly walked back out the door. That night, instead of going home, I returned to my barracks, numb with a mixture of shock and anger. I was consumed with questions. Had I been wrong about the woman I thought I knew? Or had I simply been blind to the truth all along? My friends and fellow soldiers noticed my silence, and one of them offered me a drink, sensing that something wasn't right. In that moment, the overwhelming weight of betrayal bore down on me, and I began to pour out the story of my wife's tattoo. How I had discovered it and the emptiness it left in my chest. It wasn't long before the whispers around the barracks grew louder. My superior officer eventually learned of my situation. He listened with the calm understanding that comes only from life experience. He told me, without judgment, that sometimes a man needs to choose self-respect over love, to acknowledge when a line has been crossed. In his words, I found a strange sort of validation, a confirmation that the anguish I felt was justified. That I didn't need to bear this silently. A few days later, I returned to our home to confront my wife, determined to get some answers. I asked her directly if there was anything she needed to tell me. But her response was cold and detached. She brushed off my questions with dismissive shrugs, saying only that it had nothing to do with me. Her words stung like a slap to the face. Here was a woman I had loved, respected, and sacrificed for, now standing before me with an utter lack of remorse or empathy. It was as if she were a stranger, someone I had never known at all. As I dug deeper into the situation, I discovered through neighbors and friends that she had, indeed, been spending time with this man, a friend. She called him, during my 6-week absence. The truth unraveled slowly, like a dark thread being pulled, each revelation more painful than the last. She had invited him into our home, allowed him to stay there, live there even, as if he belonged, and now, she bore his name on her skin as a permanent reminder, a mark that would never fade. In the days that followed, I wrestled with what I should do next. My heart still held onto the memories of the woman I had once loved, the life we had built together, and the promises we had made. But each time I thought of the tattoo, of the man she had chosen to bring into our lives, it became clear that those memories and promises were no longer enough. They were tainted, overshadowed by the betrayal that had poisoned our marriage. My mind replayed every conversation we had ever had about trust and loyalty. I recalled the times I had been there for her, the sacrifices I had made willingly, with love, and in each of those memories, I could see the stark contrast between who we had been and who she had become, a person willing to discard our marriage for reasons she refused to explain, who had replaced honesty with secrets and lies. I filed for divorce shortly after. It was not an easy decision, but it was the only one that allowed me to keep my dignity intact. The day I served her the papers, she reacted with an incredulous look, as if she had never considered that I might walk away. She accused me of overreacting, tried to convince me that her friend was just a passing phase, that once he was gone, things could return to normal. But I couldn't imagine a life where her betrayal would fade, where I could ignore the tattoo on her neck and the trust she had shattered. In the end, our families became involved, drawn into the chaos by her refusal to take responsibility. She painted herself as the victim, telling them that I had abandoned her, left her out of the blue. But when our parents called, I told them the truth. I told them about the tattoo, the man who had taken my place in my own home. They were shocked, perhaps even more so than I had been. Her parents, devastated, apologized on her behalf, but even their words felt hollow. As I prepared to leave, my heart heavy with the pain of a love lost, my superior officer pulled me aside once more. He reminded me that sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that protect our souls. That leaving behind a broken relationship is not a failure, but a sign of strength. He wished me well, assuring me that time would heal the scars. That one day, I would look back on this as a chapter that had shaped me but did not define me. In the weeks that followed, as I settled into a new duty station and began to rebuild my life, I felt the sting of sorrow give way to a sense of peace. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be moments of doubt, of regret, but I also knew that I had made the right choice, that I had chosen self-respect, dignity, and a future free from the shadows of betrayal. My ex-wife's actions left a deep scar, one that would take time to heal, but in that scar, I found a newfound strength, a reminder that love, without respect and loyalty, is hollow. And as I stood at the threshold of a new beginning, I promised myself that I would never again settle for anything less than a love that honored both. When faith and politics collide, a husband's journey through love and division. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet moment of gratitude, a chance to settle down for the evening, gather around the table with our 5-year-old son, and say our prayers before bedtime. It's a little ritual I've always loved, one that brings me a sense of peace after the day's chaos. So when my wife's voice drifted through our dimly lit room, her words caught me by surprise, and bless Trump. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. I shot her a sideways glance, feeling that familiar hint of tension tugging at me, the one I'd learned to ignore whenever she talked about politics. My wife and I have always had different views, but I've never let it bother me. She's fiercely devoted to her beliefs, while I've always seen myself as neutral, preferring to keep politics out of our personal life. Yet there she was, bringing Trump into our bedtime prayers. It seemed strange, but I didn't say anything that night. I shrugged it off, figuring it was a passing thing, a one-time mention. After all, everyone has their quirks, right? Who was I to judge? But it didn't stop. The next day, and the next, the mention of Trump became a fixture in her prayers, as constant as the blessings she asked for our family. She seemed to find ways to bring him up in every grace before meals, every whispered goodnight prayer with our son. I started noticing the intensity in her voice, as if she was offering a personal plea for a family member rather than a politician. That was when the discomfort began to settle in, creeping up on me like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that it was harmless, but each night, as she spoke that name, a part of me grew uneasy. I'd sit there silently, wondering what this all meant. Was this just passion, or was there something deeper? Something that had slipped beneath the surface of our relationship? As I mulled over these thoughts, memories of past moments started bubbling up, times when her political fervor had spilled over into other parts of our life. One afternoon, we were at a barbecue with friends, enjoying the sunshine and laughter. I remember her leaning over to one of my old friends, a friend I'd known since high school, who had immigrated to the US as a child, and casually asking if he had papers. The words came out lighthearted, as if it was a joke, but I saw the look on his face. My friend tried to laugh it off, but I knew it stung. That night, he pulled me aside and suggested that maybe my wife and I were growing into different people. I laughed it off back then, thinking he was overreacting, but now, those words haunted me. Was I becoming complacent, letting her words slide without standing up for what felt right? Was I choosing silence out of convenience, out of fear of conflict? I didn't want to think of myself that way, but the question lingered. At work, the discomfort followed me. My coworkers had seen her social media posts, her bold and sometimes confrontational statements. "Man, your wife doesn't hold back," one of them had remarked. Eyebrows raised. I forced a laugh, not wanting to open up a debate. I couldn't risk her opinions affecting my relationships, my job, and yet, I didn't know how to address this without turning it into a bigger issue. The final straw came when my dad had a stroke. It was a sudden, terrifying ordeal. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding, barely able to think straight. My father, who had always been my rock, lay in that sterile hospital room, weak and vulnerable. My wife joined me there, holding my hand as I whispered a prayer for him. I didn't even get the chance to say, "Amen," before she added, "And bless Trump." At that moment, I felt something snap inside me. I looked at her, My eyes wide with disbelief. Couldn't this moment, this one, deeply personal, sacred moment, be ours alone? Couldn't we just focus on my father, on our family, without bringing in the outside world? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm, and asked her if maybe, just this once, we could keep politics out of it. Her reaction was instant. She pulled her hand away, her face flushed with anger. You don't understand, she whispered harshly. He needs prayers just as much as your dad does. That night, I couldn't sleep. The conversation replayed in my mind over and over, and each time it left me with a deep, gnawing frustration. I knew I couldn't ignore this anymore. What had once felt like harmless devotion had grown into something that invaded every part of our life. I felt like I was losing her to a figure who didn't even know she existed. I felt like I was losing a part of myself, too, by letting it happen. Thanksgiving rolled around, and I hoped it would be a chance for us to reset, to focus on family and gratitude. We gathered around the table with our extended family, the room filled with the warm aroma of turkey and mashed potatoes. My wife started talking, her voice growing louder as she discussed the state of the country. Her words were passionate, but as the minutes ticked by, I noticed my mother shifting uncomfortably, my brother looking down at his plate. I knew I had to step in. I gently placed my hand on hers, trying to guide her back to the moment, to our family. Let's save that for another time, I whispered, hoping she'd understand, but her face fell, her eyes flashing with hurt and betrayal. She grew quiet after that, barely saying a word for the rest of the evening. I wanted to reach out to her, to explain, but the words didn't come. The days that followed were tense. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own world, unsure how to bridge the growing gap between us. I found myself wondering, had I failed her by not understanding her passion? Or was this simply a boundary I needed to set, a line I had to draw for the sake of our family's peace? Then came the night that shattered whatever fragile peace we'd managed to hold on to. My father passed away. It was sudden, a massive stroke that took him in the middle of the night. I was at his side, holding his hand, feeling the weight of loss settle over me. My wife stood nearby, her face somber, her hand resting on my shoulder. For a brief moment, I felt the connection we once had, a shared grief that pulled us back together. But as I whispered a final prayer over him, she closed her eyes and said, "Guide Trump to unite this country." I couldn't hold back anymore. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. Can't there be one moment, just one, that's about us? About our family, without dragging politics into it? My voice was louder than I intended, the frustration spilling out after being bottled up for so long. Her eyes flashed with anger. She accused me of belittling her beliefs, of not supporting her devotion. I countered, saying that this was about family, about respecting each other's boundaries. The argument grew heated, our voices echoing through the quiet hospital halls. I'd never seen her so hurt, and I'd never felt so helpless. That night, she left. She went to stay with a friend, taking our son in the car with her. I was left alone, grappling with the weight of grief and the realization that our relationship was hanging by a thread. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of it all. I spoke to friends, some of whom encouraged me to stand my ground, while others suggested compromise. I took time to reflect, to understand that love doesn't mean agreeing on everything, but it does mean respecting each other's boundaries. Eventually, we found a way forward. I agreed to respect her beliefs, and she promised to keep our family moments free from politics. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it allowed us to find a semblance of peace. This journey taught me a lesson about boundaries, respect, and love. I learned that being in a relationship doesn't mean absorbing every part of someone's identity. It means recognizing when something crosses into a space that's sacred, a space that should be shared and protected. I learned that sometimes, love requires standing firm, setting boundaries, even when it creates friction. In the end, we're still together, still navigating the waters of our differences. But now, we both understand that love doesn't demand complete agreement, it only asks for respect, patience, and the willingness to create spaces where both of us can feel safe and valued.